Okay, so there are three things I want to cover off today on this subject of commercial property valuations. It's a pretty dry area, so we're going to try and keep it as upbeat and as brief as possible. But those three things that I want to cover off are why a commercial property valuation is so much more expensive than a typical residential property valuation, why you should care about it, and also my prediction for what is going to happen with the price of commercial property valuations in the next few years. Hi, my name is Edward. I'm a chartered surveyor and I'm currently head of investment finance for a property division of a FTSE 100 listed company based in London. Up until recently, I was an associate lecturer at the School of Real Estate at Oxford Brookes University, teaching real estate investment finance and commercial property valuation. So hopefully I've got a really good blend of experience when it comes to both practical and theoretical knowledge that I can impart and share with you to help your commercial property investment journey go a little bit better and hopefully make it a lot more profitable. So first of all then, why is a commercial property valuation so expensive? And I think it's probably worth clarifying here. I'm not referring to sort of skyscraper type offices in the City of London or huge logistic parks. I'm talking about the type of property, commercial property, that I would expect an individual investor to get their hands on at a relatively early stage in their property investment journey. So think about high street retail properties, maybe with conversion opportunities above, or light industrial units with roller shutter doors, or maybe a small type of office building, something like that. This always comes up whenever I speak to commercial property investors who have just had a quote for a commercial property valuation. They're normally really upset, and the refrain I hear so often is, it doesn't cost me anywhere near that much money to have my house valued. And there are a couple of reasons for that, and I'm just going to race through them because I think you've probably got a pretty good idea in your head as to what they are. But first and foremost, there are lots more rubbish. First and foremost, there are loads more residential properties across the UK than there are commercial properties. So if you narrow that down and imagine a typical town in the provinces somewhere in the UK that maybe has 10,000 residential properties, chances are it will have fewer than 100 light industrial units. Equally, if you think about that same town with 10,000 residential properties and then imagine the high street, there are nowhere near 10,000 retail units along that high street. So you can begin to see then that actually the pool of evidence is much bigger and therefore easier to access for residential property. If something's easier to access, it means it's generally faster and it's going to be cheaper and more efficient to complete the residential valuation process. There's one other difference as well, and that is regulation. Commercial property and commercial property surveyors tend to be hogtied by regulation imposed on them by the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. And I'm not mincing my words. For whatever reason, the residential sector has still got to meet those same standards set down by the RICS, but they seem to be a lot more efficient in terms of processing valuations and acknowledging the regulation, but making it far more consumer friendly. Whereas with commercial property, there's still a very old school process that's followed. So letters of instruction are sent to the property owner, and if you're lucky, they'll use something like DocuSign, which will mean the process is electronic and a little bit quicker. But believe you me, there are still firms out there that have a manual signing paper process that is sent through the post. So right from the outset, commercial property valuation seems to be stuck in the past and it's really quite slow to get going. But more than that, that regulation process, something called the RICS Red Book, colloquially, or more properly known by its title, the International Valuation Standards Handbook, has to be followed. And that process that's set out in that handbook is really quite structured, and it means that the surveyor has to visit the property, they have to measure the property, usually with a handheld laser measure. So they're physically touching the walls of that property. Now imagine how slow that process is, and you've probably got a surveyor in there that is maybe charging you £200, £300, £400 an hour to walk around your property and do a laser measurement of each of the rooms in your commercial property. Then they're going to walk around the inside and the outside and make a note of the condition, and all of that stuff needs to be noted down and then written down. And again, we've got a big fall over here, because you're bloody lucky if you can find a commercial property surveyor that is effectively using an iPad or tablet type technology to capture the information that they're seeing on the ground and transpose that information into a report format immediately. In fact, there are hardly any surveyors that are equipped with that technology. So what you have is that manual transfer, even though it might be an email of notes taken on an iPad, across to a report writing function if you're lucky, or maybe that surveyor gets back to their desk and they are copying their notes out of a notebook into a report template. So there are a lot of variables in the way that surveyors work, but rest assured, they're going to be taking some time at your property. And again, this little bit that I'm covering now is going to be subject to my prediction later on, but that all takes time, because the surveyor then has to set out, in order to meet those RICS guidelines that I referred to earlier, the surveyor then has to set out a table of comparable evidence, and they have to give each comparable a weighting and a hierarchy to show you, the reader and the owner of the property being valued, what bearing they are giving to each piece of comparable evidence and why. And the job still isn't done, because what they should be doing, if they're really, really good, is phoning chartered surveyors who are maybe working for the firms that posted that comparable evidence online, just to ratify that what CoStar says or what Rightmove says is actually correct, and that the deal did happen at the rate published, and that the rent is set at the rates that they're seeing online. And so you can see telephone calls are taking place. And remember, these surveyors, they're not cheap. They're charging out at between £150 for a young graduate surveyor through to maybe £550, £600 for a senior level director or partner type surveyor. And all across the grades, they will be conducting valuation work. So you've got quite a manual process. And again, once those telephone calls are finished, they're going to be making their notes and they're going to be putting that into their report. And then they're not finished, because what they've got to do is they've got to work out what the market conditions are like in the area surrounding your property and for your particular type of property. And they're still not done. Because once they've done all that, they're then going to get onto their computer and they're going to look at a system like the one I've set up behind me, which is this is a very simple piece of valuation software that I wrote, but they'll be using something like Argus or Kel or ProDev or Apreo. All of them are subscription property valuation systems. They all come with a cost, and that cost, or a part of it, is going to be passed on to you, right? And so once all of that is done and the valuation is put together, they then send it to you, and you may have some questions, and there's a bit of back and forth between you and the valuation surveyor, and that's going to cost you money because they're not working for free. And then finally that invoice comes. Now, that invoice won't be a surprise, because you should have seen in the letter of engagement or the terms and the instructions documents that you signed right at the beginning, the fee should have been clearly set out. Surprise or not, commercial property valuations cost a lot of money, and there's no getting away from that fact. So we're then moving on to the second point, which is, why should you care? Well, you should care because you're an investor, and the one thing investors don't want to do is lose money, and they don't want to be spending money unnecessarily. And if you think about the ways that here in the UK in particular, but certainly overseas as well, commercial property can be held in pension structures or specific wrappers to be financially efficient, the performance of those pensions and the performance of those investment wrappers can be really impacted by a one-off fee, like a valuation fee. So it's really worthwhile paying attention to the valuation process right at the outset. And what I mean by that is when you get your letter of engagement, make sure that it sets out very clearly the exact purpose of the valuation. And that's your job to know that, regardless of whether you want to be one of these hands-off property investors that sort of has a portfolio of properties but you don't really want to pay much attention to them. You're going to have to pay attention when it comes to evaluation, because if the purpose of the valuation is not meted out right at the beginning, and that valuer goes to site and does all that work and fails to provide you with a value that meets the purpose of the exercise, then you're going to have to get them to revisit things, open their books again, and that's going to cost you even more money. So it's really worthwhile right at the beginning paying attention to that instruction process and making sure the purpose of valuation is nailed down. Comparable evidence is a bit of a big one, and it's often overlooked because if you think about it, that's a really laborious process for the valuation surveyor to have to go through. So right at the beginning of the valuation, when you're negotiating those terms and the letter of instruction, that sort of thing, if you can actually provide the valuation surveyor with comparable evidence from properties near yours and that are like yours, that maybe were subject to a rent review or a new lease recently, or perhaps changed hands, they were bought or sold recently, giving that sort of evidence to the valuation surveyor will, in theory, save them a lot of time. Of course, you need to give the valuation surveyor the opportunity to review that information and confirm whether they're happy to use it. But if they are, it's not unreasonable to ask them to acknowledge that when setting their fee, because you're actually saving them between 1 to 2 hours work for a standard commercial valuation. Another reason why it's worthwhile paying attention to the cost of a commercial property valuation is if your commercial property or properties are held in a pension wrapper that has multiple beneficiaries. Because if you think about it, each time one of those pension beneficiaries decides to retire, then the value of the property and the value of the pension will need to be crystallized. That means it needs to be valued. So if you've got lots of people leaving that pension scheme at different periods in time, then you potentially are going to be incurring multiple commercial property valuation fees. So thinking about the end game for your commercial property, if it's in that situation, is definitely worthwhile, because actually as you get older, the likelihood of more frequent valuation events occurring increases. Okay, finally then, the bit where I'm really putting my neck on the line is predicting what's going to happen to commercial valuation fees over the next 3 to 5 years. And this is gut instinct based on what I have seen happening in the market. And please do bear in mind, up until recently, I owned a company that was engaging commercial property valuation surveyors on behalf of commercial property owners at a rate of about 650 to 1,000 instructions per year. So I've got a fairly good handle on valuation fee rates for properties in the value range of about 250,000 through to about £1 million. And typically that fee range at the moment is between £1,250 through to around about £2,500 for a commercial property valuation. Now I'm going to cut straight to the point. I think those fees are going to triple in the next 3 to 5 years. I'm going to say that again. I reckon that the cost of a commercial property valuation will triple in the next 3 to 5 years. And the reasons for that are because professional indemnity insurance prices being charged to firms of chartered surveyors, i.e. the cost of making sure the service they provide you is insured correctly, is going through the roof. And it's been doing that for the last 3 or 4 years. And there are very few surveyors that are now unaffected by this. Moreover, there are a number of cases where firms of commercial surveyors are either amalgamating or closing completely as a direct consequence of costs increasing. And so what that means is there are fewer chartered surveyors available and qualified to conduct a commercial property valuation. So the obvious supply and demand issue arises. And you might think, well, actually, that's all right if there are loads of amalgamations because bigger firms will retain big pools of valuers, but that's not necessarily the case. We're not really seeing that happen because commercial property valuers are actually highly qualified and therefore potentially quite expensive. Also, at the top end of the tree, the big firms, CBRE, Knight Frank, Jones Lang LaSalle, Savills, they do have valuation teams, but typically they're not going to get out of bed for a fee of less than, say, £3,500, £4,000, even if it is a small light industrial unit or retail unit or office in a provincial town somewhere in the UK. And so you're seeing a squeeze on expertise, and you're going to see an increase in prices. The other issue that I see prevailing in the market that could be good news for commercial property owners is distributed ledger. And to use another word for it, blockchain. And immediately people start thinking about cryptocurrency. But stay with me because I'm not losing my mind. I firmly believe that as more and more information about property is captured electronically and therefore made available to an open distributed ledger network that can be controlled according to the transaction at the time, so you will find the efficiency of real estate transactions and real estate valuations will increase. And you might argue that that will mean the need for fewer surveyors and fewer lawyers, fewer professional property lawyers. But I don't think that's the case at all. I actually think that the role of the commercial property valuer and the role of the commercial property lawyer as a result of blockchain will become far more important to add that human expertise that is always going to be needed when you have property that is distinct from each other.